Hi, everybody. My name is James Kim. I'm the senior worship leader at Grace Point Church in Berkeley, California. My wife and I served as bivocational college ministers for several years and are currently engaged in youth ministry. I'm just real thankful for the opportunity to address this topic. In this workshop, we're going to address the problem of pain and suffering. Now, before we do anything else, I want to ask you to get something small to write on, whether it be a Post-it or an index card, or maybe tear out a piece of notebook paper. But it has to be physical, so not on your computer or on a tablet or anything digital. And then a pen and or something to write with. And you'll understand why it has to be this in a minute. So on whatever it is that you have, please write one or two words that represent something that comes to mind when thinking about this problem, the problem of pain and suffering. It could be some pain or some suffering that you yourself have experienced personally, or maybe one of a loved one or a friend or a colleague, or it could even just be something out there in the world that makes you feel the problem. So just take a moment to do that before we move on. So I'll wait a moment. So now I want to ask you to take the thing that you wrote on and fold it in half and place it under your chair or put it on the other side of the room. I just had to put some physical distance between you and that thing, and I'll explain why in a minute. In 2002, my brother and my sister-in-law gave birth to their first child, a son. They named him Jeremy after the prophet Jeremiah in the Old Testament. When Jeremy turned 2 years old, my brother called me up and he told me that they were concerned about Jeremy, because he wasn't really talking and wasn't really making eye contact, so they had him evaluated. And at that time, he was diagnosed with autism and ADHD, ADD. Several years later, I visited my brother, and he was just very physically fit. And he told me in conversation, well, it's because as his son Jeremy is getting bigger, he's getting stronger. And for his own safety, my brother told me I have to be able to physically overpower him. Why? Because Jeremy loves pools and he loves water, and yet he can't swim. So at any moment, if he sees a pool or sees a body of water, he could just take off and jump in and endanger his own life. And the seasons that followed that phone conversation and the difficulty that I saw my brother and sister-in-law go through brought me to simply ask this question: why did that happen? I believe in God, and so does my brother. Why did God allow that to happen? Jeremy, he turned 18 this year. And from what it seems, I don't think he'll be able to live independently. So on my card or on my note, I would have written the word Jeremy, the name of my nephew. I'm saying this because written on each one of those cards is something that touches real life. Every one of those cards that you guys wrote has written on it stuff that caused somebody to weep, caused some anger, caused despair. This problem touches everybody. And so I'm asking you to just physically put it away for the time being, because the things that I'm going to say in this first part of our time together could make you feel like it trivializes what you wrote on your card. But please know that if you're going through some pain and suffering right now, whatever it is, if you take anything away from this time, know that Christianity says that you have a Heavenly Father whose heart breaks right along with yours. So right at the outset, I want to say that when somebody comes to you with this problem, the Christian answer we need to give is a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on. The answer is just you being there to suffer with, which is precisely what compassion means, compassion with suffering, to suffer with. In other words, don't give the answer I'm about to give. I'm going to first address the intellectual question of the problem of suffering, how you can make sense of it philosophically and logically. And I would never go into this if somebody were to come to me with a real pain and hurt in their life. Because whether they know it or not, they're not asking from an intellectual perspective. So I don't want you or anyone to walk away with a picture of God that doesn't care or that is cold and rigid in some philosophy. So that's why I've asked you to put your cards under your chair, just put some physical distance between you, just for now as we begin. So I think it'll be helpful to define the issue, define what we're talking about here and why suffering is a problem in the first place. The whole issue of the question emerges from this statement: suffering is a bad thing that a good and powerful God would eliminate. So let's pull this apart into the statements that comprise the position. C.S. Lewis, he wrote it this way. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. So what C.S. Lewis writes here, this defines the problem. So there is suffering. Suffering exists. We all agree on that. So either God can't stop it, which means he's not all powerful, or God can but doesn't want to, which means he cannot be all good. So if he's all powerful, then he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful, or he's not there. This is a problem for Christians. Why? Because Christians believe in a God who is all powerful and all good. And it's possibly the most popular reason for many to choose atheism. Because if you think about it, atheism is an answer to the problem because there's no existence of a good, all-powerful God. Right? And so evil, pain, and suffering, I'll refer to those things interchangeably during our time together. Evil, pain, and suffering, that's just the way things are. The problem, though, is pain and suffering are experienced as wrongs because it violates the sense of the way things are supposed to be. But if you think about it, for the atheist, where does that come from? There's no reason for us to expect things to be a certain way because things are just the way that they are. So subscribing to an atheist worldview, you have to provide actually a different explanation. Why is it that I have such a strong negative response to our current world the way that it is, if that's indeed just the way that it is? So interestingly, in a sense, the problem of evil, the fact that we experience wrong and injustice and suffering, implies that there is a way that things ought to be, or the need for purpose, which supports the existence of God, actually. All this to say, this is a Christian problem. The problem of pain and suffering is a problem for a worldview that believes in an all-powerful and good God. Pain and suffering seem incompatible with the biblical understanding of God. Again, the position is suffering is a bad thing that a good and an all-powerful God would eliminate. Well, let's first talk about the all-powerful aspect of God. God can do any and all things, and so an all-powerful God would eliminate pain and suffering. So if I were to try to do this interactively, I would ask you to try to draw this for me and show it in your cameras or whatever, and I'd give you a boba or something like that. But I can't do that. But so think about this. What would you do if I asked you to successfully draw a square circle? A square circle. No, so you wouldn't be able to do that. Well, is it because you're unwilling? No, it's because you don't have enough power to. No, it has nothing to do with your willingness or your ability to do that, or your how powerful you are, because those are squares and circles are definitively different things. So there are things that God can't do. I hope that doesn't scandalize anybody here, but there are things that God can't do, and that doesn't challenge his omnipotence or his all-powerfulness. Can he make a square circle? No. Can God make something exist and not exist at the same time? Things like that. Square circle. God can't make a square circle because squares and circles are by definition incompatible. He can't do them, and it's not because he's not powerful enough, because the amount of power has nothing to do with it. They just cannot be done. So they're intrinsically impossible, and that's kind of a key phrase here. Intrinsically impossible. So square circle. That'll be kind of, when you hear that term, just think of that. We can't have a square circle. That's an intrinsic impossibility. Now, applying that same principle to the choices that we as free agents can make. Think of this. God cannot allow for us to make morally significant choices while preventing the consequences of those choices to follow through. That also is intrinsically impossible. So think about that for a second. Here's a picture of my two sons. They're 8.5 years apart. Older one's name is Jesse. Younger one's name is Riley. So I'm just going to use them as an example, and take the opportunity to throw up a picture of my kids. So let's say Jesse. Jesse, the older one, shouts out scathing insults to Riley. Mean-spirited, slanderous things, lies that defamed Riley and his entire family. And yet somehow, when he did that, the air altered the sound waves and the patterns of what Jesse was saying, such that when it reached Riley's ears, Riley heard praises of highest magnitude in beautiful song. What if whatever Jesse said to Riley, that was transformed into the same thing, the highest praises, beautiful song? how would that affect Jesse's ability to make a morally significant decision? Because lashing out lies and insults versus words of affirmation and encouragement, that's a moral decision, right? It's a choice that has some moral value associated with it. So in this situation, in order for Jesse to choose to hurl insults or to give praise to Riley, there needs to be a consistency in the matter between them, right? So the sound waves and the airwaves need to behave in a consistent way so that those sounds that represents ideas and thoughts can be communicated through the patterns of sounds that we call language, in this case, English. In other words, reality needs to be fixed. Reality needs to be fixed for them to interact. Our ability to make morally significant decisions requires a fixed reality. And so that's the other term here, fixed reality. Matter between us must be fixed for us to interact. So that was with language. Something maybe a little more physical, right? Okay, so same two kids. No, Jesse and Riley. Let's say Riley is a good person and Jesse, he's a bad person. Right? So let's say I decide to throw a rock at Jesse, a bad person who deserves it. And it hits him and he's down for the count. Okay? And God lets it happen because he's a bad person. He deserved it. But then I decide to throw a rock at Riley, a good person who doesn't deserve it. And then God says, well, I don't want that to happen. And so in the air, he changes that rock into confetti or flowers or something, or cotton candy. Now, if that happens, in what sense am I able to make a morally significant decision? Wouldn't that deny me that ability? You see how that works? So if you keep applying the same principle to an action's previous cause, then you can see that could then prevent decisions as well. So we're saying an all-powerful God would prevent evil from happening. So at what point can he do that and yet still allow for us to exercise decisions with moral significance? So should God prevent the bullet from penetrating the skin? Should God prevent the gun from firing? Should God prevent the finger from pulling the trigger? Should God prevent the brain from even having the thought? If God prevents any part of this at any point, ultimately what you get is God preventing me any morally significant decision. If he only allows choices that turn out to be morally good while preventing any morally evil ones. The dignity that God gives us is that we have free will, the ability to choose. The ability to choose good also necessarily includes the possibility and the ability to choose evil. For us to be able to have that, it requires a fixed reality, right? If God allows for us to make morally significant choices, then to have the ability and freedom to do wonderfully good necessitates in us the ability and the freedom to do horrifically bad. So we mentioned before intrinsic impossibility. So what was that example? Do you remember? It was square circle. For us to have the ability to make morally significant decisions necessarily means allowing for the consequences of those decisions. God cannot allow me the ability to make morally significant choices while at the same time prevent the consequences that would make those choices morally significant. So it's intrinsically impossible. So what I've tried to demonstrate is that there is an illogical inconsistency in the coexistence of God and evil. And this seems to be clear when pain and suffering, that's a result of human decision, as a result of people exercising their free will. And we've been talking so far about suffering resulting from moral evil. But then what about this question then? So what about natural disasters or natural evil? That's not anybody's free will or choice. We see earthquakes and hurricanes, tsunamis in recent history, and the destruction that they cause. There was an earthquake in Haiti in 2010, kills almost 300,000 people, with just as many injured. And we look at the world and the disasters in it, and you think there's something broken about it. In the midst of all the beauty that we see in nature, nature seems to also have its harsh side as well. From a biblical perspective, the Bible says we live in a fallen world, a world that is broken, a world in its current state that isn't the way that God had intended it to be in the beginning. If we look at the first chapters of the Bible, we can see what was intended when God created the world. In the first couple chapters in Genesis, the creation account, scattered throughout are words like, God said and it was so, he saw and it was good. God said and it was so, he saw and it was good, he saw and it was good. Creation and then evaluation, over and over again. At the end of the account, it all comes to a head when he creates man. He breathes into him the breath of life and places him in the rest of creation. which he evaluated as good. And God looks at that with man in the center of it, and he says, not it was good, but he says it is very good, showing to us that all things were created for man. Now, and he gives man the charge to have dominion over the rest of creation. And that's the role that we would have in creation, to continue on his creative work, the place we were given when man was under God's authority. And that was the created order of things, the way that things were supposed to be. So we have God, and then man, and then the rest of creation. God, he creates all of creation, and then man. So the created order, is wonderful until we get the fall of man. That's when man decided to reject the authority of God by taking the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in so doing, declaring, God, who are you to set that before me? Good and evil, I'll define that for myself. Thank you very much. And then they take the fruit. And the result of that is the severing of relationship with God and the rejection of God's authority and the established order. And so what follows that is the consequences of that decision. The last part of that passage, it says this in Genesis chapter 3. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Now that's interesting. So you'll work the ground, but it won't respond to you the way that you want it to. This would seem to imply that prior to this, man's relationship with the rest of the earth was qualitatively different. Is when man would work it and it would respond the way that it wanted to. But then the post-fall, that curse, it would be frustrated. So we had the created order of God, man, the rest of creation. When man rejects God, then that relationship with God is severed and creation gets messed up. And one of the consequences is that man is out of phase with the rest of the universe. And we live in a degenerative universe, irreversible deterioration. And we see that in the second law of thermodynamics. All this to say, things aren't the way that they were intended to be. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes it this way. He says, the whole creation groans and suffers together until now, in Romans 8. Now, to what degree? How much of nature isn't right? For that I'm not too sure, because some of the things that we experience are actually kind of necessary for us to have an inhabitable planet. So hurricanes, for example, distribute heat, and the plate tectonic movement that cause earthquakes, they cycle material from the mantle of the earth and is a way that the earth adjusts itself to maintain a proper equilibrium. So these processes, those, in themselves, those examples I gave you, I don't know if you can attribute a good or a bad to them. But the thing is that we actually don't have a problem with the processes in and of themselves. The pain and suffering that they cause is when these natural processes cross paths with human life in a tragic and a destructive way. So why do these things cross paths with human life in the way that they do? This is where it's not so easy to separate natural evil with human will. The earthquake that I mentioned in Haiti, a little closer look and investigation will reveal choices that people freely made to cut corners, to ignore building codes. I heard that that same 7.1 magnitude earthquake, if that hit in 90% of America, it wouldn't have had nearly the kind of effect that it had on human life as it did. And there's more that we could go into that I've learned from lectures and readings and so forth. But going back to the original premises of what we're talking about, the existence of these things don't necessarily imply that God lacks power or lacks goodness. So then you might ask, but can't he stop it a little bit? Can't he soften the blow a bit? Can't he intervene just a little? I guess it's at that point that this is where we have to question the question. How do we know that he doesn't? Of course, I can't show you some list of all the bad things that God prevented from happening because they didn't happen. But we can see them here and there in our experience. When I was a freshman, our church called an emergency prayer meeting because one of the sisters at my church, her and her husband were in our working adult department. They were giving birth to their first daughter, and that was having major complications that were life-threatening to both the child and the mom. So we gathered together at our church building and we just prayed long into the night. Several times throughout the night, we'd get a phone call saying that the doctors had given up and they just said that was it. Several times. Now you can probably see where this is going, but she gave birth to a little girl and both mom and baby were just fine. And they gave her the name Grace, believing that it was a miracle by the hand of God that allowed her mother to survive giving birth to her. So were the doctors wrong? Maybe. Were they just making things up to make it dramatic? I don't think so. Things like that happen here and there that can't be, or at least are very hard to explain scientifically, things that seem to violate their natural course. God stepping in, though. I think his intervention doesn't have to be so physically miraculous either. Now, I'm saying this more from just having lived out my own faith for some time and being connected to others who are doing the same. But I think it can happen simply through a prompting in someone's heart or some thought or idea that comes to mind. So think of it this way. You're about to do something that you know you ought not to do. But then perhaps randomly a memory of a person that you love and you care about that your actions might affect in a negative way comes to mind. So, is that just a random thought? Or might that be some kind of prompting from God? How much of that is God versus how much of that is that person's memory or conscience? Well, honestly, if it prevents me or somebody from doing something evil, then that doesn't matter that much to me. But personally, I do believe that's also God at work, stepping in to intervene in a way that doesn't violate free will. Now, if that can happen to a person for their own actions, then why not through other people as well? A prompting to go visit a friend or some provision of money or some gift or some words. And it happens to be exactly what that person needs for whatever reason. Perhaps that's God as well, stepping in to intervene. Part of the statement says, suffering is a bad thing. And that brings us to come to an interesting question, though. Is all suffering all bad all the time? The statement was, suffering is a bad thing that a good and powerful God would eliminate. Now, again, if you're going through pain and suffering of some kind right now, I apologize, and I don't mean to suggest anything about what you're going through. But if you'll just bear with me, let's consider this question. Can something good come from difficulty? Now, how many of you know people who grew up under overprotective parents? Did you ever feel like there was something not right about their upbringing in that cushioned, protected sort of way? There was this time when a lot of the brothers at my church, we were kind of the older brothers at our church, were getting together just to get to know one another a little bit. And the prompt was, what was your upbringing like, and what would you change? And for me, the answer was a little complicated because I grew up under a very strict and perfectionistic dad who had an explosive and unpredictable temper. Now, being the youngest of four, myself and I and my siblings, we would get beaten, and it was for really whatever reason. It's hard to distinguish or differentiate what we deserved versus, well, it was just because my dad was having a bad day or just not living up to his standards or just, I don't know, whatever else was going on in his life. And that was hard to grow up under that. And that was my upbringing. Now, would I change that? Was the prompt. Or how would I change that? Would I change that? I'm not sure. That because of him, the fear that I had at home turned into a deep-seated anger within me. And I would act out by being a bully at school and then finding pleasure in terrorizing others who were weaker than myself because it made me feel powerful. Now, when the gospel was explained to me, the gospel that said I am a sinner, it was very easy for me to see myself as a sinner because I was on the receiving end of the terror that my dad unleashed on us, and also I'd become much worse. I couldn't blame him because it continued in me when we were apart. I had become the very person that I hated the most and blamed for all of my problems, and yet I was worse than him. And because of that, I saw my need to be forgiven by a holy God, that I need Jesus to die on the cross for my sins. And so that's why I'm not sure if I would change anything. And so let me ask you, do you have any kinds of those stories or experiences, things that are terrible and painful and difficult, but through it you recognize that that actually hasn't been all bad for you? Do you have any of those kinds of experiences, the ennobling effect of suffering? I mentioned my brother at the beginning of our time together. And one of the things that I've experienced of him from the difficulties that he goes through in raising Jeremy, his son, is the love and compassion and sacrifice that he has gone through ever since then. I don't think I could say that that made it all worth it and that it was good for him to have that difficulty. And I couldn't say that. But certainly, what has come of that difficulty is something beautiful that I celebrate in him and his wife. They joined a church that had a special needs ministry to be with other parents in similar circumstances. And later they'd grow to be leaders in that same ministry as well, to take the comfort that they received from God through the church and his word, and to use that which was in the midst of those difficulties to comfort others. So it's in these ways that we can see God at work, even in the midst of those difficulties. Romans 8:28 says it this way. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called to his purpose. Is there a way you can look upon some difficulty you've gone through to glean some redeeming value? Whatever redeeming value you can see in retrospect, I'm guessing it isn't something that you could have seen or understood as you were going through it. And I guess that's the thing about all of this. When we have this question, when we feel the problem of suffering the most is so often at the time of the suffering. We feel it as the thing that's causing the pain is happening. But often in retrospect, we see things in a slightly different light. The thing is that we are simply not in a good position to assess that probability. We are limited in time and space and knowledge. I think we have good reasons to believe that God is good, which is why pain and suffering is a problem in the first place. So I've presented the intellectual answers that are out there, that I've known and found thus far. But in my humble opinion, I know that suffering exists. That's obvious to everyone. And I will never go as far as to say that God brings meaningless suffering. I believe he has to give in to the truth and the reality that he created because he is loving and gives us the ability to make morally significant choices, which sadly, tragically, resulted in a lot of hurt and wrong and pain. Now, does he like it? No. Does he just sit back and let all chaos loose? Well, I don't think so. I have no idea how much grace has been shown me because I will never go through the consequences of that which I've been protected from. But furthermore, he can and has taken so much of that which is dark and difficult and redeemed it with something beautiful and good. And that's God's response. And this is at the heart of the person asking the question from an emotional perspective. What does God have to say about the suffering and pain that we experience? Where is God in all the junk that we go through here? Each person has a story. So at this time, please, take a look at the card that you wrote in the beginning of our time. Everybody has something, either that they experienced or something a friend or loved one went through, or perhaps it's just a tragic something in the world that makes you look at this world and makes it such a dark and awful place. Well, what we want isn't a logical answer. We want reasons, but the reasons actually won't help. My wife, Claire, and I had some friends that I met around the time that we got married. They had a little girl named Shreya. She was 3 years old. And she developed hip cancer. I remember visiting every so often just to be with them. Now, one time when we visited, the cancer was in its later stages. And when we got there, we were brought in, but then parents and Shreya were in the TV room, and Shreya was just screaming in pain. There were some other family there, grandparents, and I think an uncle in the living room, and we just gathered there where we had to stay because Shreya in the TV room, she was in all this pain. She would only want certain people to come in at a time, and so different people going in. Grandma would go in, they get sent out, and then Uncle would go in, get sent out, and then just screaming and just so unhappy, and everybody was there, just afraid and frustrated, and really, I was there, and I just didn't know what to say. Finally, the uncle comes in. And, I've never met him before, but he looks at me and says to me in anger and frustration and worry, he says, nobody should have to go through this kind of hell. And I didn't really know what to say. I couldn't say anything. I had to agree. Several months later, the little girl died. And the heart cries out for answers. Why? But the answers or explanations won't help the heart. We turn to God and ask, how could you let this happen? But whatever explanation you give, isn't going to fix the pain. When we cry that out, what we're saying is, I miss my little girl. Or, my heart's broken for the family, for my friends who lost their little daughter. It's the outcry from the hurt. And we say, I don't want to believe in a God who would just sit idly by and let this happen. But the Christian story is God's response to the problem, that he does not sit idly by. He's not some distant creator who just set things in motion and then just checked out. His response is coming to participate in it. He shares in the suffering and takes it upon himself. The crux of the Christian doctrine is that God himself came into time and space. He limited himself to be one of us and suffered on the cross to give all people a chance to be saved. That's suffering love. I grew up without a doubt that my brother loved me. And it's simple, the reason why, because I have vivid memories of the many times that when my dad was going to hit me, he would physically step in the way to take the blows on my behalf. Suffering love, we get it when we see it. And that's God's response. It's the cross. 1 John 3:16 says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. The cross is where love and suffering meet. The cross is God's proof to us that he loves us. You go to the cross and you look up and you cry out the heart of the question. I can't believe in a God who doesn't know firsthand the suffering and pain that goes on down here on this earth. Suffering love, the suffering king. And that amazes me every time that he allowed it to happen to him. The worst possible outcome for him came upon him. He was falsely accused, gratuitously tortured, and slowly executed. He didn't create all this pain and suffering, all the evil in the world, but he paid for it all. And every single person has to grapple with this question, why would he do that? Alvin Plantinga writes it this way, as the Christian sees things, God does not stand idly by, coolly observing the suffering of his creatures. He enters into and shares our suffering. He endures the anguish of seeing his son consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death on the cross. Christ was prepared to endure the agonies of hell itself in order to overcome sin and death and the evils that afflict our world and to confer on us a life more glorious than we can imagine. He was prepared to suffer on our behalf, to accept suffering of which we can form no conception. I look upon the cross and I remember that it is because of my sins that Jesus died there. My sins, all the sins of the world, starting with that initial rejection of God's authority. I appreciate the Passion of the Christ movie because I look upon the torture, the flogging, knowing the kind of person Jesus showed himself to be on earth, and I cry out, nobody should have to go through that kind of hell. At the cross, you don't get an answer to the question, but you see God's response to it all. And furthermore, you see his solution. If through the cross, you can find an eternal existence with God without pain and suffering, returning to the way that creation was meant to be, then the Bible presents you with a God who not only shares in our suffering, but redeems it with an eternity that makes any mortal lifetime with or without suffering only momentary. So that's all I have. So if you go, maybe we can just take a moment just to jot down some thoughts that you had from our time together.